The phone call came at 2:12 a.m. I've always feared late-night calls, those cruel interruptions that never bring anything good. My hand shook as I reached for the phone, the room heavy with that strange stillness only found between midnight and dawn. "Mrs. Carter," a calm voice said on the other end. "This is Providence General Hospital. Your son Daniel has been admitted with a suspected brain aneurysm. You should come immediately." For a second I thought I'd misheard. The world around me tilted soundless. I had lived 64 years, survived my husband's cancer, buried my parents, endured loneliness, but nothing could prepare me for the thought that my son might be dying. Daniel, my steady, kind, brilliant Daniel, wasn't supposed to be next. Not him, not yet. I arrived at the hospital in my nightgown beneath an overcoat, hair uncombed, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the receptionist ask for my name. A nurse guided me into a cold consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and sorrow. When the doctor entered, his face told me everything before his words did. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Carter. The aneurysm ruptured before he reached us. There was nothing we could do." His mouth kept moving, explaining procedures, timing, medical terms, but all I heard was the echo of two words: "Already gone." I don't remember how long I sat there. At some point, a nurse brought me tea. I couldn't drink. The clock ticked. My body felt heavy, disconnected from time. When dawn crept through the hospital blinds, painting everything in pale gray, I was still there, holding Daniel's watch in my trembling hand, the last thing they'd given me. My son's watch was still ticking, stubbornly alive when he no longer was. It was nearly noon when she arrived. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, walked into the waiting area wearing oversized sunglasses and a designer trench coat that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle. "I came as soon as I could," she said, sliding her phone into her purse. There was traffic. I noticed her manicure before I noticed her eyes, perfect glossy pink. She didn't meet my gaze. "Where's Daniel?" she asked. I swallowed hard. "He's gone," I said simply. She froze, lips parted slightly in an expression that might have been shock or performance. Then came the faintest tremor in her voice. "Gone. But he was fine yesterday. We had dinner and then he stayed up working in his study. I went to bed early. I didn't even say goodnight." For a fleeting second, I saw a glimmer of genuine regret. It vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by something cooler, calculation perhaps. "What happens now?" she asked, as though she were discussing a delayed flight rather than the death of her husband. "We'll need to notify his attorney, I suppose." I stared at her, unable to speak. Somewhere deep down, an old instinct stirred, a quiet primal warning. By evening, Daniel's body had been released to the funeral home. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. Grief clung to me like fog, thick and unrelenting. When Vanessa finally sat beside me in the family lounge, she scrolled her phone between shallow sighs. "I'll handle arrangements," she said softly, like a line from a script. "You shouldn't have to worry about anything." I nodded. "Do you think Eli should see him?" I asked. "He's only 8, she replied, voice too quick, too flat. "No point in traumatizing him." Her words stung. Eli adored his father, he deserved a goodbye. But I said nothing. Thomas Bennett arrived just before dusk. Daniel's best friend since law school, now his personal attorney. His eyes were swollen, rimmed red. "I can't believe it," he whispered, taking my hand. "We had lunch Monday. He seemed fine." When he noticed Vanessa, he offered his condolences with the solemn courtesy of a man used to grief. She nodded mechanically, murmuring, "Thank you." Thomas hesitated before speaking again. "We'll need to meet soon," he said gently. "There are immediate matters in Daniel's will that should be addressed." At this, Vanessa perked up. Her posture straightened, her voice steadied. "Of course, the sooner the better for Eli's sake." Eli, the name felt like a lifeline in the fog. My grandson. Daniel's only child. The thought of him, small, gentle, trusting, kept me from collapsing. He was with his schoolmate's family that day. I had already arranged it. Vanessa hadn't thought to. That alone told me everything. When we left the hospital, the sun was setting. I walked slowly through the parking lot, clutching Daniel's watch. Vanessa's heels clicked rhythmically beside me. "You know," she said, suddenly, "Daniel always handled all the finances. I'll need access to his accounts soon just to keep things running." I looked at her, at the precise curl of her hair, the faint impatience in her tone. My son wasn't even buried yet. Let's focus on the funeral first, I managed. She smiled, but her eyes didn't soften. Of course, Eleanor. I'm only thinking ahead. That night, the house felt different. The air heavier, the silence louder. I sat in Daniel's study, the lamp still on, papers scattered across the desk, a coffee cup half full beside his laptop. It smelled of him, cedar ink and aftershave. I traced my fingers over the family photo on the shelf. Daniel holding Eli, both laughing, Vanessa posing with a practiced smile. My throat tightened. I whispered to the empty room, "What did you see in her, Daniel?" But the only answer was the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I tried to sleep but couldn't. At 3 a.m., I wandered into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stared out the window into the dark. My reflection looked like someone else's, a woman aged overnight. On the counter lay Daniel's unopened mail, his car keys, his reading glasses. Each object was a reminder of a life abruptly severed. My chest ached with the cruel imbalance of it all. A mother isn't meant to outlive her child. By morning, I forced myself into motion. I called the funeral director, the florist, the pastor. Routine became armor. When Vanessa arrived mid-morning, she carried a bouquet of white lilies, beautiful, expensive, lifeless. "They said you were making arrangements," she noted, as though disappointed she hadn't been consulted first. "I thought we could do something tasteful. Simple." Daniel never liked fuss. I looked at her perfectly made-up face, wondering if she'd shed a single real tear. "He liked sincerity," I replied quietly. She smiled without warmth. "Then simple it is." As the day wore on, more people called, Daniel's colleagues, old college friends, neighbors. Each voice said the same things: so sudden, so unfair, he was such a good man. I agreed with all of them. When I finally hung up the phone that evening, the house was quiet again. Vanessa had gone home. I stood in the hallway staring at the framed photo of Daniel holding baby Eli the day he was born. I remembered the weight of that tiny body in my arms, Daniel's proud, teary smile. "He's perfect, Mom," he'd whispered. And he had been. Now that same child was sleeping somewhere else, unaware his father was gone, unaware that everything he knew had changed. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the steady tick of Daniel's watch against my palm. "For Eli," I whispered. "I have to be strong for him." But beneath that vow, another thought surfaced, quieter, darker, unspoken. Something about Vanessa's calmness, her careful words, the absence of grief in her eyes, none of it felt right. I'd spent 30 years teaching psychology. I knew the difference between genuine sorrow and performance. My instincts screamed that there was more to this story, something Daniel might have seen but never told me. And as I looked toward his study one last time before turning out the lights, I felt it, not just grief, but an unfamiliar chill crawling up my spine, a sense that this tragedy was only the beginning. The church smelled of lilies and wax, that strange blend of sweetness and sorrow reserved only for funerals. I sat in the front pew, my hands clasped tightly around a damp tissue, staring at the closed casket that held what was left of my son. Around me, voices murmured, clothes rustled, and the organ played softly, an old hymn Daniel used to hum absent-mindedly while fixing Eli's bike. I couldn't breathe properly. The air felt too thick, the light too dim, and the sight of my grandson sitting beside me, small and trembling, was almost more than I could bear. Vanessa sat on my other side, the picture of composed tragedy. She wore a fitted black dress that was more flattering than somber. Her makeup expertly applied, her hair styled in soft waves that framed her face just so. She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, though the corners of her lashes remained dry. "He would have appreciated such a turnout," she whispered to me, leaning close enough for the faint scent of her perfume to mix with the incense. "Daniel always made people feel valued." Her tone was perfect, gentle, poised, and entirely hollow. To the congregation we must have looked like a united front, the grieving widow and the devastated mother supporting each other in shared loss. Only I could feel how lightly she leaned against me, ready to pull away the moment anyone important approached. When the pastor began his eulogy, Vanessa's eyes swept over the room with practiced precision, pausing on every influential face, every potential benefactor or future ally. I watched her adjust her expression depending on who met her gaze, compassionate for Daniel's colleagues, fragile for his clients, stoic for the neighbors. She was performing grief, and she was very, very good at it. Eli sat between us, clutching the corner of my shawl. His face was blotchy from crying, his small shoulders shaking in quiet bursts. When the pastor said the words "gone too soon," Eli let out a soft sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and buried his face against my arm. I held him close, whispering, "It's all right, sweetheart. Daddy loved you so much." After the service, the line of mourners stretched endlessly. Daniel had touched so many lives. Each person had a story, how he'd helped them through a divorce, a lawsuit, a loss. A woman in her 50s gripped my hand and said, "Your son helped me keep my house when I thought I'd lose it. He refused to charge me when he found out I couldn't afford his fee." Another man said Daniel took my case when no one else would. He believed in fairness. Each word felt like both comfort and torture. My son had lived a life of integrity, kindness, and quiet strength. I stored every story like a treasure, something I could give to Eli when he was older, when he was ready to understand who his father truly was. Vanessa floated through the crowd like a shadow of glamour, offering polite smiles and accepting condolences with careful grace. I noticed she gravitated toward the wealthier guests, her hand lingering on the arm of one particular man, a tall, expensively dressed stranger with sharp features and a watch worth more than my car. When I approached, she turned smoothly and introduced him. "Mom, this is Richard Harlow, one of Daniel's real estate partners." "Mrs. Carter," he said, his tone clipped his handshake brief. "Your son was an exceptional man." There was something in his voice, distant, detached, that set my nerves on edge. The way Vanessa's hand brushed his sleeve as she spoke made my stomach tighten. They were too familiar for two people who should have only known each other professionally. I excused myself quickly, pretending to need air. Outside, the sunlight hit me hard, as if the world refused to mourn with me. I leaned against the stone railing, breathing in the cold air, trying to steady myself. Behind me, through the church doors, I could hear Vanessa's laughter, soft, musical, entirely out of place. Hours later, after the last mourner had gone and Eli had fallen asleep on a couch in the reception room, Thomas Bennett approached me. His suit was slightly rumpled, his expression lined with exhaustion and sympathy. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "there are things Daniel asked me to handle personally. He left instructions for you." I blinked at him, confused. "Instructions?" Thomas nodded. "I'll explain tomorrow. For now, there's one thing he wanted me to tell you right away." He hesitated, lowering his voice. He said, "Trust your instincts about Eli." "Does that mean something to you?" I looked at my sleeping grandson, his small hand curled around the edge of a black blazer far too big for him. Then I glanced at Vanessa, who was standing a few feet away, checking her reflection in her compact mirror, while pretending to listen to someone's condolences. "Yes," I said slowly. "I believe it does." Thomas gave a single knowing nod. "We'll talk at my office tomorrow. There's a lot to go through." That night I brought Eli home with me. Vanessa didn't protest. She said she needed time to process, her voice devoid of warmth. She arrived the next morning, looking perfectly refreshed, makeup flawless, wearing soft beige instead of black. "I barely slept," she announced, though her eyes sparkled. "Have you heard from the funeral director about the final arrangements? They're scheduled," I said, "tomorrow at 11. She sighed, sitting at the kitchen island and stirring sugar into her coffee like she owned the place. "I think I'll take Eli to stay with my parents in Arizona for a while after the service. A change of scenery might help him heal." My heart jolted. "Arizona? So soon?" she shrugged. "It's best for him. There's no sense lingering in sadness." I watched her carefully. Her tone wasn't that of a grieving mother, it was logistical, efficient, like she was discussing a business transfer. "Eli should finish the school term first," I said gently. "He needs consistency right now." Her smile faltered. "We'll see." Later that afternoon, while Eli colored quietly at the dining table, Vanessa took a call in the other room. I could hear her voice through the half-closed door, sharp, impatient. "I told you not until after the will is settled. Just wait." A pause. "Yes, I know what he said, but it's in my name now. He won't fight me. He's dead." My breath caught. I backed away before she could see me. When she reappeared minutes later, her voice was smooth again, her face perfectly composed. "I'm meeting Thomas tomorrow," she said. "You should come too. He's handling everything." That evening I sat beside Eli as he fell asleep. He whispered, "Grandma, is Daddy really in heaven?" "Yes, sweetheart," I said softly. "He's watching over you right now." "Then why does Mommy keep saying, 'We're moving'?" I hesitated, brushing his hair from his forehead. "Because sometimes grown-ups think running away will make them hurt less." He nodded sleepily. "I don't want to run away." Tears burned my eyes. "You won't? I promise." The next day I walked into Thomas Bennett's office with a heart heavy as stone. Vanessa was already there, legs crossed elegantly, phone on the table beside her. Thomas looked between us, his expression unreadable. "I'll get straight to it," he said. "Daniel's will was updated 3 months ago. There are a few changes that will need immediate attention." Vanessa's smile wavered. "Changes, yes," Thomas said. "He left the lake house, the investments, and a life insurance policy to you. The primary residence, both vehicles and his personal account, go to his mother." The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa's lips parted, eyes wide. "That can't be right. The house is ours, marital property." Thomas slid a folder toward her. "Actually, the deed remains solely in Daniel's name. He purchased it before the marriage." Vanessa's carefully crafted composure cracked for the first time. Her face flushed and her nails dug into the leather chair. "This is absurd. He would never do that." Thomas didn't flinch. "He did. The documents are legally binding." I sat motionless, my mind spinning. Daniel had never told me any of this. Why would he transfer everything to me, and not his wife? Why had he changed his will just 3 months ago? Vanessa's voice turned brittle. "What about Eli's college fund? Surely I'm the trustee." Thomas shook his head. "No. That responsibility goes to Mrs. Carter as well." Her jaw tightened. "So I'm supposed to believe my husband rewrote everything and never said a word?" "What kind of manipulation, please?" Thomas interrupted softly. "Let's stay civil." I watched her carefully, remembering the phone call, the fake tears, the calm precision. Daniel had known something. He had seen something. And whatever it was, he had tried to protect his son and me from it. As we left the office, Vanessa's mask slid back into place. "We'll talk later," she said sweetly, though her voice vibrated with barely contained fury. She walked ahead, her heels clicking like gunshots against the marble floor. When I reached my car, my hands were still trembling. In my purse lay the sealed envelope Thomas had given me, my name, written in Daniel's familiar handwriting. I hadn't opened it yet, but I could feel its weight like a heartbeat. Whatever secrets my son had taken to his grave, I knew they were about to surface, and nothing would ever be the same again. I waited until the house was quiet before opening the envelope. The paper trembled between my fingers, my pulse hammering in my ears as if Daniel himself were standing behind me. Inside was a single sheet of stationery from his law office, his handwriting steady and familiar. "Mom, if you're reading this, the unthinkable has happened. I'm sorry to leave you with this burden, but I trust no one more. My marriage has been unraveling for some time. What began as distance has turned into something darker. I've discovered things about Vanessa that make me fear for Eli's future and for your safety. I've arranged things to protect you both. The assets, the accounts, they're safeguards, not gifts. She'll fight this, and she'll try to manipulate you. Don't let her know what you suspect. Watch, wait, document everything. Thomas has the rest of my instructions. I love you, Mom. You taught me to see people clearly. Use that gift now to protect my son." The room spun as I finished reading. For a long time I just sat there clutching the letter to my chest, the ink smudging beneath my tears. My son had died, afraid not for himself, but for us. The will wasn't a random act of favoritism, it was a fortress, and somehow I was its gatekeeper. By morning I had stopped shaking. I brewed a pot of coffee and laid Daniel's letter on the kitchen table beside a notebook. I wrote the first entry, January 24th. Daniel's warning: Vanessa will fight. Observe. Record. Protect Eli. Then I underlined the last word 3 times. When Vanessa arrived later that day, she carried herself with the crisp authority of someone who'd spent the night plotting. Eleanor, she said brightly, placing her designer bag on the counter, I think we should talk about arrangements going forward. Of course, I replied, keeping my tone mild. Would you like some coffee? She smiled, as though the act of sharing coffee could smooth away every jagged edge between us. That would be lovely. As I poured, I noticed how her eyes scanned the kitchen, taking silent inventory of what was now legally mine. This house, she began stirring cream into her cup, it's full of memories. For Eli especially, every room reminds him of Daniel. I think it might be too painful for him to stay here much longer. I set her cup down carefully. You're considering moving, yes. A change of environment would help both of us heal. I've found a condo downtown near the art museum, great schools, family-friendly, excellent security. I nodded thoughtfully, hiding the rush of alarm in my chest. That sounds nice. She took a measured sip of coffee, watching me over the rim of her cup. There's just one problem, of course. With the will the way it is, I can't access the house's equity. It doesn't make sense for me to live somewhere that's technically not mine. Daniel would never have wanted it this way. I folded my hands in my lap. The lawyer said it was updated 3 months ago. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed smooth. Exactly. During a time when he wasn't himself. He was exhausted, overworked. You know how he got when he was under pressure. Yes, I said softly. I do. Her smile returned brittle and sweet. So I've been speaking with an attorney who believes we can fix this. No need for a messy court case. If you just transfer the deed, we can avoid all that unpleasantness. For Eli's sake. There it was. The test. The bait. I lowered my gaze, letting a shadow of confusion play across my face. Oh, I don't know about legal matters, dear. I suppose Thomas would have to review anything official. She waved her manicured hand dismissively. Of course, I just thought we could settle things privately between family. Daniel would have wanted peace. Peace. The word sounded like poison in her mouth. Maybe, I said, I'll think about it. Her smile broadened, confident now. Take your time. But the sooner we make arrangements, the better for everyone. When she left, I waited until the sound of her car disappeared before pulling out my notebook. I wrote everything she'd said, every expression, every pause. She's calculating. Testing boundaries. Must stay quiet. That evening, as I tucked Eli into bed, he looked up at me with wide, serious eyes. Grandma, are we moving? I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. What makes you ask that? Mom said we might go to a new place. She said Daddy wouldn't mind. My heart clenched. Do you want to move? He hesitated. I like it here. Daddy used to read me stories in this room. I kissed the top of his head. Then we'll stay for a while, all right. Sometimes adults just talk about things before they really decide. He nodded sleepily. Grandma, did Daddy know something bad was going to happen? The question pierced through me. Why would you ask that, sweetheart? Because he told me once, Eli whispered, eyes half closed, that no matter what, I'd always be safe with you. I sat beside him long after he fell asleep, watching his chest rise and fall. Daniel had known. He'd known everything. The next morning I called Thomas. She's already trying to manipulate me, I said, skipping any greeting. I assumed she would, he replied. Daniel anticipated that. How direct was she? She wants me to transfer the house. Claims it's for Eli's stability. Thomas exhaled slowly. Then she's moving faster than I expected. Good. That means she's scared. Keep playing along. Don't refuse anything outright. Let her think you're considering it. Meanwhile, I'll prepare the paperwork for your protection. What kind of paperwork? Documentation of her contact, her behavior. Everything you can record, do it. Daniel wasn't wrong to worry. There's more to this than greed. Later that day, I found Vanessa in the driveway supervising movers carrying boxes into her car. Just sorting through Daniel's files, she said quickly when she saw me. He had so many business documents lying around. I recognized the leather briefcase she was holding. It had been Daniel's, and inside it I knew were personal folders. Be careful with those, I said evenly. Some might be confidential. She smiled. I'm sure Daniel wouldn't mind his wife keeping a few memories. When she drove away, I called Thomas again. She's taking files. Photograph what's missing if you can, he instructed. We'll need a list for the estate inventory. That night I found one of Daniel's old external drives in the bottom drawer of his desk. inside a folder titled Trust Documents, password protected. I stared at it for a long time before closing the laptop. Some truths I realized needed patience. Over the next few days, Vanessa's behavior shifted between charm and irritation. She'd show up, unannounced, bringing pastries, complimenting my cooking, pretending to be caring. "Eli loves spending time here," she'd say, eyes darting toward the study. "You've been such a help." Then just as quickly her tone would harden. "But we need to establish boundaries. He's my son." I know I'd answer quietly, "I'm just helping." Her gaze would linger on me, assessing, searching for weakness. She'd find none. By Friday she called to say she had an important meeting in the city and asked me to keep Eli overnight. Of course, I agreed. But later that evening when I stepped outside to take out the trash, I saw a car parked across the street, a sleek black sedan I didn't recognize. Through the windshield I caught a glimpse of Vanessa in the passenger seat, her head bent close to a man's. The glow of her phone lit her smile. "Ryan Harlow." I took a photo before the car pulled away. My hands didn't shake this time. I went inside, poured a glass of wine and opened my notebook. Friday 10:37 p.m. Vanessa, seen with Richard Harlow. Possible affair, keep record. For Daniel. For Eli. As I wrote, I felt something solidify inside me, a cold, calm certainty. Daniel's last letter wasn't a warning, it was a command. And I intended to obey it. Sunday mornings had always been quiet in this house. Daniel used to make pancakes while humming old Beatles songs, and Eli would sit on the counter swinging his legs and spilling flour everywhere. That morning the silence was so heavy I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of Daniel's watch on the counter, the faint rustle of wind outside. I was flipping pancakes when Eli padded into the kitchen, hair mussed, still half asleep. "Grandma," he said softly. "Why does Mom smile when her phone rings but frown when I talk to her?" I froze, the spatula trembling in my hand. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" he shrugged, rubbing his eyes. "She's always talking to someone named Ryan. I heard her say his name yesterday." Then she said, "Don't worry, he's too old to notice anything." I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "Adults say silly things sometimes. You don't need to worry about that." He nodded, satisfied for the moment, but my heart felt like stone. Daniel's letter echoed in my head. Watch. Wait. Document everything. After breakfast, I sent Eli to play in the backyard and pulled out my notebook. I wrote every word he'd said, underlined Ryan twice. Then I called Thomas. "She's becoming careless," I said. "She always was," he replied. Daniel mentioned that once she believes she's in control, she gets sloppy. "Keep collecting what you can. But Eleanor, be careful. Don't let her know you suspect anything." "I won't," I promised, though my stomach twisted with unease. By noon, Vanessa arrived. She swept through the front door carrying shopping bags and a bright artificial smile. "I brought Eli some new clothes," she announced, as if returning from a heroic expedition. "He's outgrowing everything." I watched her unpack designer shirts with tags still on them. "That's thoughtful of you," I said. "Well, someone has to think ahead," she replied, tossing her hair. "Oh, and I spoke with my attorney about the house. He says there's a way to expedite the transfer once we settle some paperwork. I can have documents ready by next week." I smiled faintly. "Wonderful. Be sure to include Thomas in the discussion." Her eyes flickered. "Is that really necessary?" "Daniel trusted him," I said. Her lips tightened. "Fine. If that makes you feel better." She turned her attention back to the shopping bags, her movements sharp and efficient. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. Every conversation with Vanessa felt like walking across a frozen lake, quiet, dangerous, unpredictable. One wrong word and the ice would shatter. That evening, I found Daniel's old laptop on the bookshelf. I hesitated before opening it, half afraid of what I might find. It powered up easily, the wallpaper, still a picture of Eli on his 8th birthday, frosting on his nose. There was a folder labeled Personal. I clicked. Inside, a dozen encrypted files. One stood out, Contingency. My heart pounded as I tried to open it, but it required a password. I stared at the prompt for a long time before typing the first thing that came to mind, Eli. The screen blinked, denied. I tried again, Vanessa. Denied. I leaned back, exhaling. Daniel had been many things, careful was one of them. I closed the laptop and looked at the study, at the half-filled shelves, the stack of unopened mail. Everything about this room felt alive with his presence, as if he'd just stepped out and would walk back in any moment. But he wouldn't. It was up to me now. Later that night, I was jolted awake by the phone ringing. It was Nancy Cole, the private investigator Thomas had mentioned he might contact. "Mrs. Carter," she said in a low, steady voice, "Thomas gave me your number. I've been following up on the lead about Vanessa's business partner. Thought you'd want to know what we've found." I sat up, gripping the phone. "Tell me." "She's been meeting regularly with a man named Ryan Harlow," Nancy said. "They've been spotted together at a property management firm, restaurants, even a hotel downtown. Last night she stayed there until after midnight." Cold spread through my chest. "Do you have proof, photos, timestamps, credit card logs?" Nancy replied. "Your son was right to be suspicious. I think Vanessa's been moving assets from Daniel's accounts into joint ventures under Ryan's name." I pressed a hand to my forehead. "So it's not just an affair?" "No, ma'am. It's strategy." After we hung up, I sat in the dark, the ticking of the clock unbearably loud. Daniel had sensed this coming. His will, the transfers, he hadn't acted out of favoritism. He'd been building a shield. My job wasn't only to grieve. It was to defend what he'd left behind. The next morning, I decided to confront her indirectly. At breakfast, I told Eli, "We'll go to the park today. Would you like that?" His face brightened. "Can we bring Mom? Let's invite her," I said, though my plan was already forming. When Vanessa arrived, she wore oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. "A park day, that's sweet," she said, sliding into the driver's seat. "I'll drive." At the park, she spent most of the time on her phone, pacing near the fountain, while Eli played with other children. I sat on a nearby bench, pretending to read, while actually watching her reflection in the water. I could see her smile, soften her voice, lighten the same expression Eli had described. When she hung up, she approached, her tone honeyed. "I've been thinking," she said. "Maybe I've been too abrupt about the house. We're family after all, let's start fresh." "That's a kind thought," I said. "Fresh starts are important." Her eyes brightened, encouraged by my calm. "Exactly, and to make things easier, I'll bring over the financial records later this week. We can go through them together." "Wonderful," I replied. "I'll have Thomas join us then." Her smile faltered again. "Always, Thomas. He's good with numbers," I said simply. When she turned away to call someone again, I took out my phone and snapped a picture of her reflection in the water, hand lifted to her ear, smiling like a woman in love. That evening, Nancy called again. "Got something else?" she said. "There's a transaction from Daniel's secondary business account, $10,000 transferred to a company registered under Ryan Harlow's firm, dated 2 weeks before your son's death." I felt the room tilt. "Can you trace where it went?" "Working on it. But if I were you, Mrs. Carter, I'd keep Eli close. This doesn't look like simple greed anymore." The line went quiet. I stared out the window at the dark yard, the silhouette of the old oak tree swaying in the wind. I thought of Daniel's last letter, of his warning to watch and wait. But waiting was becoming unbearable. That night, as I tucked Eli into bed, he looked up and said, "Grandma, Daddy used to say we were the same. Both quiet but brave." "Do you think he was right?" I smiled, brushing his hair. "Yes, sweetheart. More than you know." He grinned sleepily. "Then maybe I can be brave for you too." After he fell asleep, I sat by his bedside, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest. Somewhere in the house, Daniel's watch ticked steadily, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. I opened my notebook again, turned to a fresh page, and wrote, "Sunday. She's planning something. Evidence growing. Daniel was right, she's dangerous." Tomorrow, Thomas and Nancy need to see everything. For the first time since that night at the hospital, I didn't feel helpless. Grief had forged something new inside me, a cold, steady resolve. Whatever Vanessa was planning, I would be ready. I woke before dawn, unable to shake the unease pressing on my chest. The sky outside was still dark, streaked faintly with gray. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's letter beside me, its creases already worn soft from how often I had unfolded it. The words seemed heavier, now prophetic. She'll fight this. She'll manipulate you. He had known exactly how it would unfold. When the first light broke, I called Thomas. It's time, I said quietly. He didn't need to ask what I meant. Meet me at the office at 9, he replied. Bring your notes. Nancy will join us. By the time I arrived, the city was wide awake, horns, footsteps, the rush of ordinary people whose worlds hadn't shattered. Thomas's office sat above a quiet street lined with old brick buildings. Inside, he had cleared the conference table. Nancy was already there, a neat stack of photos and printouts in front of her. Morning, Mrs. Carter, she said, nodding respectfully. We've been busy. Thomas gestured for me to sit. Nancy's uncovered some alarming things. She slid several photos toward me. They showed Vanessa and Ryan together at a cafe in his car at what looked like a marina. She's been meeting with him almost daily, Nancy said. And yesterday she met with a real estate broker about listing the lake house. The one in your name. I stared at the image. Vanessa's smile glowed under the sun, her hand brushing Ryan's arm. She can't sell what doesn't belong to her, I said. Thomas folded his hands. No, but she can try, and that's exactly what she's doing. She's using the argument that the will was influenced by you. By me. She's implying emotional coercion. That Daniel was manipulated while grieving his father's death. The words hit me like a slap. That's absurd. Thomas's expression softened. It is. But it's a common tactic in cases like this. She's building a story. What we need is to stay several steps ahead. Nancy tapped a document on the table. We've traced a series of transfers from one of Daniel's secondary accounts, money funneled through Ryan's company. There's also an email thread between Ryan and Vanessa. It's not explicit, but it references clearing the slate once things are finalized. Finalized, I repeated. Thomas nodded grimly. Likely referring to Daniel's estate. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My son had been protecting us from more than infidelity. He'd been shielding us from theft. How much? About 40,000 so far, Nancy said. But we're still looking. I pressed a hand to my temple. He knew. That's why he changed everything. Thomas's voice softened. And that's why he trusted you. You can't let her suspect you know any of this. I exhaled slowly. Then we continue as if nothing's wrong. Exactly, he said. You're the calm widow, still grieving, easy to underestimate. When I left his office I felt strangely lighter. Fear had turned into something sharper, steadier, a sense of purpose. That evening Vanessa called. Eleanor, I was thinking about having dinner tomorrow, she said in her falsely sweet tone. You, me, Eli. Maybe talk about how to move forward. Of course, I replied. That sounds nice. Good, she said, her relief palpable. Let's try to keep things civil, shall we? The next evening she arrived wearing a soft blue dress and diamond earrings. She brought wine, expensive and ostentatious, and kissed my cheek as if we were lifelong friends. For new beginnings, she said. We ate in the dining room. Eli chattered about school, about the solar system project his class was starting. Dad used to help me with stuff like that, he said, his voice small but steady. Vanessa smiled tightly. You'll do fine, honey. Grandma's smart. When Eli went to his room, the tone shifted. Vanessa set her glass down and folded her hands. I spoke with my attorney again, she said. He believes Daniel's will could be contested, but I'd rather not put Eli through that. So I'm proposing a compromise. I met her gaze calm and steady. I'm listening. You sign over the house and vehicles, she said. In exchange, I'll let Eli spend as much time with you as you want. Every weekend, holidays, whatever you like. We can even put it in writing. I stared at her for a long moment. You're offering me visitation with my own grandson in exchange for my home. She tilted her head, unfazed. It's not as cold as it sounds. You don't really want the burden of maintaining all this, do you? And it's what Daniel would have wanted for his family to stay together. Family, I repeated quietly. Is that what this is? Her smile wavered. You've always had issues with me, Eleanor. I get it. But I'm trying to make peace here. I took a slow sip of wine, letting silence stretch between us. Peace can't be bought, I said finally. But I'll think about your offer. Please do, she said, relaxing slightly. We both love Eli. Let's not make this ugly. When she left, I waited by the window until her taillights disappeared down the street. Then I took out my phone and played the recording app. Every word of our conversation had been captured. The next morning I called Thomas again. She made her move, I told him. She offered a deal, yes. Transfer the assets for visitation rights. He let out a slow whistle. That's coercion, Eleanor. We couldn't have asked for clearer evidence. Save the file, send it to me encrypted. We're building a case stronger than she'll ever realize. Later that day, Nancy stopped by with a thick folder. Thought you should see this yourself, she said. Your son hired me 6 months ago. Before everything. Inside were photographs, phone records, and a report titled, Subject Vanessa Carter. Daniel had written notes in the margins. Unexplained withdrawals. Emotional volatility. Possible extramarital relationship. I turned the last page and found a handwritten note addressed to Thomas. If anything happens to me, protect my mother and Eli. Vanessa is not who she pretends to be. Tears blurred my vision. My son had been building this defense in silence, preparing for a danger he couldn't stop. He must have felt so alone, I whispered. Nancy's expression softened. He trusted you to finish what he started. That night I watched Eli sleep, the soft rhythm of his breathing steadying my heart. On his nightstand sat a framed photo of Daniel holding him at the lake. I whispered, he's safe, my love. You did everything you could. Now it's my turn. Before going to bed, I opened my notebook again and wrote, Vanessa escalates. Attempted coercion recorded. Continue documentation. Contact Thomas for next steps. Then, almost as an afterthought, I added, do not underestimate her capacity for desperation. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a watchtower. And I was ready to defend it. The morning after the dinner, the house felt unusually still. Even the sunlight seemed cautious, spilling softly across the kitchen table, where Daniel's watch ticked beside my coffee cup. I couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa's words, her voice sweet, her threat wrapped in velvet. You sign over the house and vehicles. I'll let Eli see you as much as you want. She'd said it so easily, as if generosity were a weapon she wielded for sport. At 8, I heard the small shuffle of footsteps. Eli appeared in the doorway holding his backpack. Grandma Mom says she's taking me to Miami next weekend, he said. His tone was casual, but there was a shadow in his eyes. Miami, I repeated. That sounds far away. He nodded. She said her friend Ryan has a boat. We'll go out on the ocean. He hesitated. But I have a science project due Monday. Dad always helped me with my projects. My throat tightened. Did you tell your mom that? She said I can skip it. She said teachers understand when your dad dies, his voice caught. But Dad wouldn't like that. I knelt down and brushed his hair back gently. No, sweetheart. Your dad believed in finishing what you start. Don't worry, we'll figure something out. After dropping Eli at school, I called Thomas. She's taking him to Miami, I said. His tone sharpened. With Ryan, that's what Eli said. She told him Ryan has a boat. There was a pause. Eleanor, that's dangerous. She's trying to remove him from the jurisdiction. I'll contact the investigator again. Do not confront her yet. We need documentation. That evening I found Vanessa waiting in the kitchen, dressed impeccably as always. Eleanor, she said, kissing the air near my cheek. We need to talk. I agree, I said. Coffee, she declined with a wave. I've been thinking about the will. Maybe I've been too emotional. This constant tension, it's not good for Eli. No, it's not, I said. She smiled faintly, sensing agreement. So, I have an idea. What if we each took some time? I'll take Eli for a little vacation. Just the two of us. We both need healing. I leaned against the counter studying her. And where will you go, Miami? She said. A friend offered us his condo. It'll be perfect. I let my voice stay mild. And Ryan will be there. Her eyes flicked up sharply, then smoothed over. He might stop by. He's been helping with some property matters Daniel left unresolved. I smiled faintly. Daniel never mentioned any property matters with Ryan. Well, she said, tone light but eyes cold. Daniel didn't tell you everything, did he? I said nothing. Silence made her restless. She picked up her purse, the faintest tremor in her hand, betraying nerves. Anyway, she said Eli needs a break. I'll bring him back Sunday night. I'm sure he'll enjoy the ocean, I said evenly. After she left, I called Nancy. She's leaving Friday, I said. I want eyes on her the entire trip. Consider it done, Nancy replied. If she sets foot on that boat, we'll have pictures. Friday came too quickly. Vanessa arrived in a sleeveless white dress, sunglasses perched like armor. Be good for your grandmother, sweetheart, she told Eli, then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Try not to worry so much, he's my son after all. I never forget that, I said. Hours later, I sat in the quiet of Daniel's study, watching the rain streak down the window. Every instinct in me screamed that something about this trip was wrong. When the phone rang, my heart leapt. It was Nancy. They left around noon, she said. Checked into the Royal Marina Resort. Ryan's with them. I've got photos. Thank you, I said. Please keep an eye on Eli. Saturday passed like a fever. I cleaned, read, pretended to eat, but my mind was hundreds of miles away. When Sunday evening came, I waited by the window. 9 o'clock. 10. No car. At last, near midnight, Vanessa's SUV pulled into the driveway. Eli climbed out slowly, clutching his backpack. His shoulders drooped. Vanessa was on her phone, laughing softly. Don't be dramatic, she said into the receiver. It was fine. The weather was perfect. I opened the door before she could knock. You're late, I said. Traffic, she replied. He's tired. We'll talk tomorrow. Eli slipped past me and headed upstairs. I caught his wrist gently. Are you all right, honey? He nodded, eyes downcast. Just tired. After Vanessa left, I followed him to his room. He sat on the bed still wearing his travel clothes, his face pale. Did you have fun? I asked. He hesitated. Mom and Ryan went out on the boat without me. I stayed with a babysitter. She fell asleep and I got scared. I sat beside him fighting the urge to cry. Did you tell your mom? He nodded miserably. She said she needs to be happy too and I shouldn't make things harder. The words twisted like a knife in my chest. I pulled him close. It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. After he fell asleep, I crept into the study and opened my journal. Miami trip completed. Left child unattended overnight. Neglect, documented. My pen trembled as I wrote. The next morning I met Thomas and Nancy at the cafe near his office. Nancy laid out a folder of photographs. One showed Vanessa on the deck of a yacht, drink in hand, Ryan's arm around her waist. Another, time-stamped after midnight, showed the two entering the resort. Thomas leaned back, expression grim. That's enough, he said. Between the recordings, the financial evidence, and this, we can file an emergency petition for temporary custody. I stared at the photos. Would the court even consider it? With this much documentation, yes, Thomas said. Especially if Eli's welfare is at risk. I looked out the window, the city blurred through the rain. Do it, I said quietly. Whatever it takes to protect him. When I got home, Vanessa was waiting on the porch, arms crossed. You've been talking to Thomas, haven't you? I forced a small smile. He's Daniel's attorney, of course we talk. She stepped closer, voice low and sharp. I know what you're doing. You think you're smarter than me, but you're not. I'm his mother, he belongs with me. I met her gaze, calmly. Then be his mother, act like it. Her mouth tightened. You're going to regret crossing me, perhaps, I said. But not as much as you'll regret underestimating me. She glared at me, then turned and stormed off to her car. The engine roared, tires squealing as she sped away. When the house fell quiet again, I exhaled slowly, letting the tremor in my hands fade. The storm outside raged, wind rattling the windows, but for the first time since Daniel's death, I felt steady. The path ahead was clear. I walked into Eli's room and pulled the blanket higher over his shoulders. He stirred, murmuring something in his sleep, something about pancakes, about his dad. I'll keep you safe, I whispered. I promise. Downstairs, Daniel's watch ticked steadily on the counter, marking each second with quiet precision, as if reminding me that every moment mattered. By morning, Thomas's message arrived. Petition ready. We file tomorrow. Be prepared for her reaction. I looked toward the garden where the first sunlight pierced through the storm clouds. I murmured. Let her come. The rain stopped sometime before dawn. I woke to a silence so complete it almost hummed. The kind of silence that comes after something has broken. I brewed a pot of coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching light rise over the wet garden. The air smelled of damp earth and lilacs. Somewhere inside I could feel it, the shift. The moment grief became purpose. By 7 I had the plan written in Daniel's old notebook. 3 steps, simple but precise: observe, record, expose. I underlined the last word twice. At 8, Vanessa's car pulled into the driveway. I didn't move. I wanted her to think I was still half asleep, harmless. She let herself in without knocking heels, clicking sharply across the floor. "Eleanor," she called, voice honeyed but tight. "We need to talk." I turned, smiling faintly. "Coffee." She waved the offer away, setting her bag on the counter. "You've filed something, haven't you? Don't lie." "Thomas called my lawyer." I raised an eyebrow. "Thomas speaks to a lot of people." Her hands tightened around her purse straps. "You're trying to take my son." "No," I said calmly. "I'm trying to keep him safe." Her expression flickered rage, disbelief, calculation, then smoothed back into practiced grief. "You're being manipulated. Lawyers love drama. Daniel wouldn't want this." "Daniel trusted me," I said softly. She stared for a beat, then exhaled dramatically. "Fine. Let's not fight, not today. I came to apologize for the other night. Things got heated." "I've forgotten already," I lied. "Good." She smiled too easily. "Let's have dinner tomorrow." "My treat. We'll talk things through." "That would be lovely." As soon as she left, I dialed Michael Harrington, Daniel's second attorney. "She's changing tactics," I said. "She's nervous," he replied. "Good. Keep her close. The more she talks, the more she'll give us." "I intend to." That afternoon, I met Nancy in the cafe by the courthouse. She wore a dark trench coat and carried a thin folder. "You wanted surveillance detail?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Install a small camera in the living room. Discreet. If she thinks I'm surrendering, she'll relax." Nancy nodded. "And when she relaxes, she talks." Exactly. That night after Eli fell asleep, Nancy came by. Together, we placed a small camera inside a potted plant near the bookshelf, its lens barely visible beneath a leaf. "Motion activated," she said quietly. "You'll get alerts to your phone." When she left, I stood in the middle of the living room staring at the framed photograph on the mantel, Daniel holding Eli, sunlight glinting in their eyes. "You saw her clearly, didn't you?" I whispered. "You knew what she was." The next evening, Vanessa arrived for dinner wearing a fitted navy dress and a smile polished to perfection. "You look well," she said, setting down a bottle of wine. "So do you," I replied. "I didn't expect you so early. I thought we could cook together, like family." She moved through the kitchen as if she'd rehearsed it, opening drawers, arranging utensils. I let her. I'd already turned on the small recorder in my pocket. Over dinner she was almost charming. She asked about my garden, about Eli's grades. "He's such a bright child," she said. "It would be a shame if he got caught between adults' mistakes." "I agree," I said. She leaned forward, her tone softening. "So maybe we can fix this. I've been thinking about transferring some funds to you just as goodwill. If you drop the custody petition, we can call it even." "Even," I repeated. "That's an interesting word. Come on, Eleanor. We're both tired of lawyers and paperwork. Let's make peace." "For Eli, peace built on a bribe isn't peace," I said gently. Her smile cracked. "It's not a bribe, it's practical. You're alone. You could use the money. I'm trying to help. I'm not the one who needs help." Her eyes darkened. "You think you're untouchable because of that will, because Daniel gave you his house. You're not. People forget widows, but they love tragic young mothers." I set my fork down, keeping my voice calm. "Are you threatening me?" She laughed lightly. "Of course not. I'm reminding you that sympathy fades fast. Public opinion doesn't favor old women meddling in custody battles." I smiled. "Fortunately, public opinion doesn't decide custody. Evidence does." Her hand froze mid-air. "What evidence?" I sipped my wine. "You'll find out soon enough." For the first time I saw fear in her eyes, not much but enough to glimpse the crack in her armor. She pushed her chair back. "I should go." "Thank you for dinner," I said. After she left, I sat in silence for a long time. Then my phone buzzed. Motion detected living room. I opened the camera feed. Vanessa had forgotten her scarf and come back inside. She didn't call out for me. Instead, she walked straight to Daniel's study. On the screen, she rifled through drawers, opened folders, and pulled out the sealed envelope I'd left intentionally visible on the desk, a decoy with blank papers inside. She unfolded it, frowned, and muttered, "Idiot." Then she took out her phone and snapped photos. The next morning I called Nancy. "We got her," I said. "She broke in, she came back after dinner. Caught on camera." Nancy whistled softly. "Perfect. That's enough for intent." But it wasn't enough for me. I wanted her words, her confession, the truth that Daniel had died knowing but couldn't speak. That afternoon I visited Michael's office. "I want to draw her out," I said. "Make her comfortable enough to admit what she's done." He hesitated. "You're playing a dangerous game." "I know," I said. "But I need her to say it herself." "Then we set a stage," he said finally. "Something that looks harmless. Let her believe she's winning." When I returned home, the house felt different, alive with intent. I baked a lemon pie, something Daniel used to love, and left it cooling by the window. The smell filled the air, sweet and deceptive. Eli came running in after school, his laughter breaking through the tension. "It smells like Daddy's birthday," he said. I smiled, kneeling to hug him. "It's just pie, sweetheart. Some memories are worth keeping." He looked up at me seriously. "Grandma, are we safe?" The question hit harder than I expected. "Always," I said firmly. After he went to bed, I stood by the window looking out at the dark garden. My reflection stared back at me, a woman, older, sharper, quieter than she'd been weeks ago. The phone buzzed again. A message from Nancy. "Got the files from Miami. They match Ryan's account transfers. She's cornered." I set the phone down and whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow we end this." Then I blew out the candle on the counter, the flame shrinking to nothing, and listened to the steady hum of the house. For the first time in months I felt no fear, only focus. Vanessa thought she was playing a game, but she hadn't realized yet the board was mine. The next morning began with a knock on the door sharp enough to set my pulse racing. I glanced through the peephole and saw a man in a gray suit, holding a briefcase, his tie perfectly knotted. Beside him stood Vanessa, face composed, lips curved into the faintest imitation of sympathy. I opened the door slowly. "Mrs. Carter," the man said, extending a card. "Gerald Winters, legal counsel for Miss Vanessa Carter." "May we come in?" I stepped aside without a word. Vanessa brushed past me, perfume strong enough to mask the scent of the rain still clinging to her coat. She sat at the table like it belonged to her. Winters followed, setting his briefcase down and snapping it open. "We're here to discuss a proposal that could prevent a lengthy and unpleasant court process." "I thought that's what dinner was for," I said mildly. Vanessa gave a short laugh. "You misinterpreted that as an apology. This is business." Winters slid a thick document across the table. "Miss Carter is prepared to offer a settlement. You transfer ownership of the Oakview property, the vehicles, and associated assets back to her. In exchange, she agrees to refrain from contesting the will and to provide continued visitation with your grandson." I glanced at Vanessa, who sat poised, her red nails tapping lightly against her wineglass. "You mean," I said, "you'll allow me to see my grandson if I surrender everything my son left me?" "That's a dramatic interpretation," Winters replied. "We're offering closure, a clean division." Vanessa leaned forward. "Let's stop pretending, Eleanor. You don't want the stress of court. You're too old for this kind of fight." I smiled faintly. "You may be right about that. Then we're in agreement." "Not quite," I said, sliding the paper back toward her. "You see, I've already reviewed something similar. And I know how Daniel felt about people using legal tricks to justify moral failures." Her composure faltered. "You don't know anything about what Daniel felt." I looked straight into her eyes. "He left me a letter." The color drained from her face. "What letter?" "That's not your concern," I said softly. "But I will tell you this, he knew." Her mask cracked just for a second. "You're bluffing." Winters cleared his throat clearly, sensing the conversation slipping away. "Mrs. Carter, I suggest you take time to review our proposal before making any emotional statements." "I'll have my attorney do that," I said, rising. "Now, unless there's anything else, I think we're done." Vanessa stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. "You're going to regret this," she hissed. "You have no idea what I can do." I met her fury with quiet calm. "And you have no idea what Daniel already did." They left without another word. I waited until their car disappeared down the street before calling Thomas. She brought her attorney, I said. They tried to buy me off. That's good, Thomas said. It means she's scared. She knows the evidence is solid. She looked shaken when I mentioned Daniel's letter. Then she's wondering what else he left behind. Use that. Let her imagination do the work for us. That evening I poured a glass of wine and sat in Daniel's study. The rain had started again, tapping softly against the windows. I opened the drawer where I kept the real letter creases worn from my hands. She'll try to manipulate you. Don't confront her too soon. Let her reveal herself. I whispered. You were right, my love. She's unraveling. The following day, Nancy texted surveillance caught her meeting with Ryan and Winters last night. They looked tense, sharing documents. She's losing control. By noon, I received another message from an unknown number. Meet me alone, Riverside Park, 3 p.m. No lawyers. If you want the truth about Daniel. I stared at the screen. The tone was too precise, too deliberate. It had to be her. At exactly 3, I arrived at the park. The wind off the river was cold, carrying the scent of damp leaves and rust. Vanessa sat on a bench facing the water, her sunglasses hiding whatever expression she wore. I approached slowly. You came, she said, without turning. You texted. I thought maybe we could speak like human beings for once. I've always been human, I replied. You're the one who treats people like currency. She laughed bitterly. You think you know everything, don't you? That letter, those documents, Daniel wasn't some saint. He was planning to leave me long before he died. You think that's noble? My heart pounded. He was protecting his son. He was punishing me, she snapped. Do you even know what it's like living with someone who looks at you every day and wishes you were someone else? He made me feel invisible, Eleanor, like I was an accessory in his perfect life. Then why stay? I asked quietly. Her jaw tightened. Because I earned that life. I built it with him. And I wasn't about to let you or anyone else take it away. So you took it yourself. Her lips parted a flash of fury before she regained control. Don't twist my words. You don't need me to twist them, I said softly. They twist themselves. She stood abruptly. You have no proof of anything. Whatever games Daniel was playing, he's gone. And when this is over, you'll be left with nothing but your self-righteous grief. I let her words hang in the cold air. Then quietly I said, you should go. She hesitated, searching my face for weakness. Finding none, she turned and walked away. As soon as she was out of sight, I pulled my phone from my pocket. The voice recorder glowed red, every word captured. That evening Thomas listened to the audio, his eyes widening as Vanessa's anger spilled from the speakers. This is perfect, he said. She's admitted resentment, motive, emotional instability. It corroborates everything in the psychological evaluation we're compiling. She's not done, I said. I saw it in her eyes. She's desperate enough to do something reckless. He nodded slowly. Then we'll be ready when she does. When I got home, Eli was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a box of Legos spread around him. Grandma, he said without looking up, Mom called. She said she's going to make everything better. I swallowed hard. Did she say how? She just said she's tired of everyone judging her. And she might go somewhere new where no one knows us. He frowned. Does that mean me too? My chest tightened. No, sweetheart, I said softly. You're not going anywhere. He nodded, but his little hands trembled slightly as he fitted two pieces together. I sat down beside him, helping him build the tower in silence. The pieces clicked, softly rhythmic grounding. After he went to bed, I returned to the study and called Thomas again. She's planning to run, I said. Eli told me. I'll contact the court tomorrow, he said. We'll file the emergency motion first thing. If she tries to leave the state, we'll have a restraining order ready. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, shaking the windows. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. She's cornered, Thomas said before hanging up. That's when people like her are most dangerous. When I turned away from the window, the faint light from the desk lamp caught Daniel's photograph. His smile seemed softer tonight, less haunted. I'm close, I whispered. I'll protect him, Daniel, just like you asked me to. Then I blew out the candle beside his picture, the scent of wax and smoke mingling with the rain outside, and for the first time in weeks I allowed myself to hope. The call came just after breakfast. Thomas's voice was brisk, urgent. "Eleanor, it's happening." She filed a motion to dismiss the custody case. "She's claiming you manipulated evidence and alienated Lucas from his mother. We have less than 48 hours before the hearing." I closed my eyes, gripping the counter for balance. "She's faster than we thought. She's desperate," he said. "But I've already countered the motion. We have the recordings, the Miami photos, the financial transfers, and her own confession from the park. We're solid. Still, you need to be ready. This will get ugly." "I've been ready since the night Daniel's letter arrived," I replied quietly. He hesitated before adding, "There's something else. Our investigator found out she's been looking at international properties again with Ryan, this time in the Cayman Islands." A cold chill spread through me. "She's planning to leave." "Exactly. If the court dismisses the case, she'll take Lucas and vanish. We need to make sure that doesn't happen." After hanging up, I stood by the window watching Lucas play with his Lego set, his laughter bright against the storm forming outside. The thought of him gone, stolen from everything safe, tightened my chest until breathing hurt. When the doorbell rang, I startled. Vanessa stood there radiant in a cream suit, her hair perfectly styled, sunglasses perched like armor. "Eleanor," she said smoothly, "I thought we could talk before tomorrow. No lawyers, just us." I considered closing the door. But something inside me, the part that had learned to listen instead of react, told me to let her speak. "Fine," I said, stepping aside. She moved through the house slowly, glancing around as though already rehearsing ownership. "Still keeping everything just as Daniel left it," she murmured. "You always did like to live in the past." "This is Lucas's home," I replied. "For now," she said, smiling faintly. "But you know how temporary court orders can be." I folded my arms. "What do you want, Vanessa?" Her voice softened, false sympathy dripping from every word. "To save us both some pain. Withdraw your petition. Stop this madness. You can still see Lucas whenever you like. I'll even sign an agreement." I met her gaze calmly. "You said the same thing before, with your lawyer sitting right here." Her smile didn't waver. "And I'm offering again. Because if you keep pushing, I'll make sure you regret it. Daniel's will, I can have it tied up in appeals for years. The house, the accounts, you'll drown in paperwork before you ever get to breathe." "Threats won't work on me," I said. "They're not threats, they're promises." Something in her tone shifted, colder, heavier. Then she leaned closer. "You think Daniel was perfect. You think he didn't have secrets too." The question caught me off guard. "What are you talking about?" She smiled, that sly, rehearsed smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Maybe you should ask Thomas about the investment deals Daniel was handling before he died. You might find out your sainted son wasn't as pure as you thought." I felt the faintest flicker of doubt, a shadow twisting through the calm I'd built. She saw it and pressed harder. "It's sad, really, how easily people believe what they want to believe." I turned away, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "You should leave." She walked toward the door, then paused, hand on the knob. "Enjoy your time with Lucas while you can, Eleanor. Because after tomorrow he'll be with me, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it." When the door closed behind her, I finally exhaled. My hands trembled. But not from fear, from fury. She was trying to shake me, to seed doubt before the hearing. That evening, Thomas came by in person. The look on his face told me everything before he even spoke. "You saw her," he said. "She mentioned something about Daniel's investments. Claimed he was hiding something." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "She's fishing. Daniel's accounts were spotless. We reviewed every transaction. But she's counting on you to panic, to question him, to stumble tomorrow." "I won't," I said firmly. "Not after everything he did to protect us." Thomas gave a small nod. "Then we'll be fine. The judge is fair, but you'll need to keep your composure, no matter what they say." After he left, I checked on Lucas. He was asleep, curled around his stuffed bear, one hand clutching the corner of a photo frame, the picture of him and Daniel at the lake. His small, trusting face broke my heart all over again. I sat beside his bed and whispered, "No one's taking you anywhere." The next morning the sky was bruised gray. Rain drummed softly as we walked into the courthouse. Vanessa was already there, with her attorney immaculate in a black dress, clutching tissues she didn't need. Her performance had begun. Inside the courtroom, her lawyer rose first. Your Honor, my client has endured months of defamation and emotional abuse. She is a grieving widow and mother whose child has been manipulated by the petitioner's obsessive interference. I watched as Vanessa dabbed her eyes delicately, lowering her gaze just as the judge looked her way. The performance was flawless. Thomas stood next. Calm, deliberate. Your Honor, we have extensive documentation of neglect, coercion, and attempted alienation. We also have recordings, photographic evidence, and financial inconsistencies linking Miss Carter to an extramarital partner involved in her late husband's accounts. Vanessa's head snapped up. That's a lie, she shouted before catching herself. The judge's eyebrow lifted. Miss Carter, please allow counsel to speak. Thomas continued unfazed, playing the recording from the park. Her voice filled the courtroom, venomous and sharp. He made me feel invisible, Eleanor. I wasn't about to let you or anyone else take it away. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. The judge's expression hardened. Vanessa's attorney scrambled to recover, claiming emotional manipulation doctored evidence, but it was too late. The mask had slipped. When the hearing ended, the judge announced she would review everything and issue a ruling within 24 hours. We were dismissed. Outside in the courthouse hallway, Vanessa stormed toward me, eyes blazing. You think you've won? You don't know who you're dealing with. Thomas stepped between us. That's enough, Miss Carter. She sneered. Enjoy your little victory. You'll lose him eventually. Everyone loses something. Her words echoed long after she was gone. That night, the house felt heavier, the air thick with waiting. Lucas climbed into my lap while we read together. Grandma, he whispered, Mom said maybe we'll move somewhere warm soon. Is that true? No, sweetheart, I said softly. We're staying right here. He nodded sleepily. Good. I don't like warm. I like our snow. After he drifted off, I walked downstairs and sat in Daniel's study. On the desk lay his letter, his handwriting faded at the edges. I traced the words with my fingertips. Trust your instincts, protect him. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. I felt its echo in my bones, warning promise both. Tomorrow everything would change again. Either the judge would grant us safety, or I'd have to fight harder than ever to keep my grandson from vanishing into a world where justice didn't reach. The courthouse was nearly empty when I arrived the next morning, the echo of my footsteps following me through the marble halls. My palms were damp despite the cool air. Thomas met me outside the courtroom, papers in hand, his expression unreadable. She's already here, he said quietly. Came early with Winters. Looks confident, but don't let that fool you. I nodded, forcing a steady breath. Has the judge made a decision? Not yet. But she'll rule today. Whatever happens, keep your composure. The judge will be watching both of you closely. When we entered the courtroom, Vanessa was seated at the front, a portrait of composed fragility. Her hair was pinned neatly, makeup soft and mournful. A small framed photo of Daniel and Lucas sat before her, perfectly staged. I took my seat behind Thomas, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on every heartbeat. Judge Morrison entered promptly at 9, her robe sweeping as she took her place. She adjusted her glasses, eyes flicking between us. After reviewing the evidence presented, including the petitioner's exhibits, recorded statements, and the respondent's motion to dismiss, this court is prepared to make a ruling. The silence in the room deepened until even the sound of my breathing felt loud. The court finds sufficient cause for temporary guardianship of the minor Lucas Carter to remain with his grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Carter, pending a full custody evaluation. Vanessa's sharp intake of breath was the only sound that broke the stillness. The judge continued, her tone firm. Furthermore, due to concerning evidence of neglect and potential parental instability, Ms. Carter's visitation will remain supervised. Both parties are prohibited from removing the child from the state without explicit court approval. A collective murmur rippled through the room. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes, tears stinging behind my eyes. Vanessa shot to her feet. This is ridiculous. He's my son. You can't just. Sit down, Miss Carter, the judge ordered sharply. Your outburst only reinforces the court's concerns. If you wish to appeal, do so through proper channels. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering frantically, but Vanessa yanked her arm free and stormed out of the courtroom. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. It's not permanent yet, but it's a huge step. Lucas stays with you. I nodded slowly, relief mixing with exhaustion. Thank you, I managed. Outside, the gray sky hung low, the air heavy with drizzle. As we walked toward the car, I spotted Vanessa near the parking lot pacing, her phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance I could hear the fury in her voice. You told me it would work, Gerald. She shouldn't have that boy another day. Her lawyer tried to calm her, but she spun away, eyes flashing when she saw me. You think this is over, she hissed, stepping closer. You've made me look like a fool in front of everyone. But don't forget you're old, Eleanor. Time's on my side. I looked at her calmly. Maybe. But Lucas isn't a trophy to wait for. He's a child who needs love, and that's something you've already lost the chance to give. She laughed bitterly, her lipstick smeared at the corner of her mouth. You talk like you're some saint. You think I didn't see how you treated Daniel, always meddling, always judging. You turned him against me. He saw you clearly, all on his own, I said softly. For a moment, her face twisted with rage, but then she stepped back, smoothing her jacket. Enjoy your victory, Eleanor. It won't last. I watched her drive off, tires screeching against the wet pavement. Thomas sighed beside me. She's spiraling. That's dangerous. Keep the house locked and the cameras running. I'll arrange for the evaluator to meet Lucas tomorrow. When we got home, Lucas ran to the door, his face bright with hope. Grandma, did the judge decide? Am I staying here? I knelt, wrapping my arms around him. Yes, sweetheart. You're staying right here with me. His little body relaxed, the tension of weeks finally easing. Does that mean Mom's not mad anymore? My heart ached. I think your mom needs some time to figure things out. But we'll make sure she's okay, all right. He nodded, content with that, and ran off to show me the drawings he'd made while waiting. Each one was of our garden, the apple tree, the bird feeder, the little swing Daniel had built for him. Roots, I thought. My boy had roots now. That evening after Lucas went to bed, I sat in Daniel's study with the door closed. The letter lay before me, its edges worn soft. I traced his handwriting again, whispering the words I knew by heart. Trust your instincts. Protect him. Outside, a car engine idled, faint but persistent. I moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. A dark SUV sat at the curb, headlights off. My stomach clenched. Then the phone rang. Eleanor Thomas's voice said, low and tense. I just got word from Nancy. Vanessa withdrew nearly half her account balance this afternoon. She's booked one-way tickets to Phoenix for tomorrow morning. I gripped the windowsill. Phoenix? She can't leave the state. She knows that. Which means she's planning something she doesn't want documented. Maybe an attempt to take Lucas herself. My pulse quickened. What do we do? Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. If she shows up, don't confront her. Call the police immediately. I'm alerting the judge and filing for a restraining order tonight. After we hung up, I checked the locks twice, then peeked through the curtains again. The SUV was gone. For the rest of the night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep, every gust of wind like a whisper. At one point I thought I saw headlights flash briefly through the front window, but when I checked, the street was empty. Sometime before dawn, I drifted into uneasy sleep. I dreamed of Daniel standing by the lake, calling my name, his voice calm but urgent. Stay strong, Mom. She'll show you who she really is. Don't look away. When I woke, sunlight was cutting through the curtains. The house was silent except for the sound of birds outside. For a moment, everything felt almost normal. Then I noticed the back door. The latch was unhooked. I froze, every muscle locking. Quietly, I checked Lucas's room. He was still asleep, safe and oblivious. I crept downstairs, heart pounding, scanning every shadow. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I knew someone had been here. When Thomas arrived an hour later, I showed him the door. He knelt, examining the lock. No forced entry. She used a key. She still has one, I said. He straightened, face hard. Then she crossed a line. We'll report it. The restraining order will go through today. I looked toward the staircase where sunlight pooled on the steps like a fragile promise. She won't stop, will she? No, Thomas said quietly. But neither will we. That night, after Lucas had fallen asleep again, I sat in the darkened living room, Daniel's letter in my lap, and whispered to the empty air, "I'm ready for whatever comes next." The silence answered, calm and steady like the surface of the lake before a storm. The knock came at midnight. It wasn't loud, but deliberate, a rhythm too careful to be random. I froze halfway down the hallway listening. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. My pulse thudded in my ears. I turned off the light and peered through the curtain. A figure stood on the porch, motionless in the rain. For one awful second, I thought it was Daniel, tall, broad shoulders, head slightly bowed. Then lightning flashed and I saw the pale face beneath the hood. Vanessa. I didn't move. She didn't either. We stared at each other through the glass for what felt like a lifetime before she reached into her coat pocket. My heart leapt, but she only pulled out a key, holding it up like a trophy, smiling faintly. Then she slid it into the lock and turned. The deadbolt stopped her. She rattled the door, whispering something I couldn't make out. Finally, she leaned close to the glass. "You think a piece of paper can stop me?" Her voice was low, slurred, but venomous. "He's my son." I stepped back, phone in hand, and dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, practiced. "What's your emergency?" "This is Eleanor Carter," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My daughter-in-law is at my door. She's not supposed to be here. I have a restraining order." "Stay inside, ma'am. Officers are on the way." When I looked back, Vanessa was still there, her hair plastered to her face from the rain. She slammed a hand against the glass. "You took everything from me," she shouted. "You turned him against me, and now you want to steal Lucas too." Her voice cracked on his name. "He's all I have left." "Go home, Vanessa," I said through the door. "Please just go home." But she only laughed, a sound sharp and broken. "Home? You mean your home? Because Daniel made sure I have nothing. You win, Eleanor. You win everything." She leaned her forehead against the glass. "Except you don't know the whole story." Before I could respond, headlights swept across the driveway. She turned, startled, as a patrol car pulled up. The officers moved quickly, their flashlights cutting through the rain. One of them called out her name, firm but even. Vanessa stepped back, hands trembling, mascara streaking down her face. "I just wanted to see my son," she cried. "She won't let me see him." The younger officer approached slowly. "Miss Carter, you're violating a court order. You need to come with us." "I didn't hurt anyone," she shouted. "I just wanted to talk." Her voice echoed through the night as they led her toward the car. I watched through the glass, shaking until the red and blue lights faded down the street. When the house fell quiet again, I locked the door and sank to the floor, breath coming in ragged bursts. Upstairs, I heard Lucas stir. I forced myself up the stairs, every step heavy. He stood in the hallway in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Grandma, who was here?" "No one you need to worry about, sweetheart," I said softly, pulling him into a hug. "Everything's okay now." "Was it Mom?" he whispered. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." He buried his face in my shoulder. "She sounded mad." "She's just confused," I said gently. "She loves you, even if she doesn't always show it the right way." He didn't answer. His small arms tightened around my neck until I thought my heart might break. The next morning, Thomas arrived early. He looked older, wearier, as he stood in the kitchen doorway. "Police filed the report," he said. "She's being held overnight. They'll likely issue a mandatory psychiatric evaluation." I poured him coffee, my hands still trembling. "She said something strange before they came, that I don't know the whole story." He frowned. "That's just manipulation. Don't let her get in your head." But later that day, as the house quieted and Lucas napped, her words kept circling in my mind like a storm that refused to pass. By evening, a courier arrived with a small envelope from Thomas's office. Inside were copies of documents Vanessa had submitted to the court earlier in the week. Financial statements, text messages, fabricated desperate attempts to rewrite history. But tucked among them was something I hadn't seen before, a scanned page from Daniel's journal dated 3 months before his death. "Ryan came by again today. Vanessa says it's business, but something's off. I can't confront her yet, not without proof. Thomas says to wait. Still, I keep thinking if anything happens to me, I need to make sure Mom and Lucas are safe. But what if I'm wrong? What if she's not what I think she is?" I read the words over and over, my breath catching on that last line. What if she's not what I think she is? For the first time, doubt crept in. Had Daniel misunderstood something? Had he missed a truth I wasn't seeing? That night I sat in the study staring at the flickering shadows on the wall. Every instinct told me Vanessa was dangerous, manipulative. But Daniel's hesitation haunted me. Maybe there was something I didn't know. When my phone buzzed, I nearly dropped it. A text from an unknown number. "Eleanor, please. Let me explain. Just 5 minutes. You owe me that much." My first impulse was to delete it, to block the number. But something stopped me. Maybe it was exhaustion, or compassion, or the ghost of Daniel's doubt. 5 minutes, I typed back. "Tomorrow. Noon. The church courtyard." Thomas was furious when I told him. "That's reckless, Eleanor. She's unstable. You can't just meet her alone." "I won't be alone," I said. "You'll be nearby." "But I need to hear what she has to say." He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "If she tries anything, she won't," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The next day the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Sunlight glinted off the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church, painting the courtyard in fractured color. I sat on a bench waiting. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a plain gray coat, her hair pulled back. She looked smaller, somehow tired, almost human. "I didn't come to fight," she said quietly. "I came to tell you the truth." I folded my hands. "Then tell it." She glanced around, lowering her voice. "Daniel didn't just change the will because of me. He changed it because of himself. He was in trouble, Eleanor. Legal trouble. He was moving money for a client, money he wasn't supposed to touch. Ryan was helping him cover it up." I stared at her, stunned. "You expect me to believe that?" She nodded. "Believe what you want. But I have proof. Bank records, emails. If I go down, he goes down too. Maybe that's why he was so afraid." I studied her face, searching for the lie. But for once, she didn't look like she was acting. There was something raw there, fear maybe, or regret. "I don't know what game you're playing," I said slowly, "but dragging Daniel's name through the mud won't save you." She smiled faintly. "You think I'm lying? Check the accounts he used for Lucas's trust. Look at the dates. You'll see what I mean." Then she stood, slipping something into my coat pocket. "Do what you want with it," she said, turning away. "It's all that's left of him that's still true." When she was gone, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. The sun caught the metal, flashing like a blade. That night I sat alone in Daniel's study, the drive on the desk before me, and whispered to the empty room. "What did you do, my son?" The computer hummed softly as I plugged it in. A folder appeared. Inside were bank transfers, client names, and a message file labeled simply, "For Mom." My hand trembled as I clicked it open. And then I saw Daniel's face on the screen, recorded months before his death. His voice filled the room. "Mom, if you're watching this, then something's gone wrong. Mom, if you're watching this, then something's gone wrong." Daniel's recorded voice filled the room, low and steady, but tinged with something I hadn't heard before, fear. The camera trembled slightly, like he had set it up in a hurry. "I know how this looks, but please listen before you judge. You need to understand everything before you decide what to do." I leaned forward, my pulse loud in my ears. Daniel sat behind his desk, the same one I was sitting at now. His eyes looked tired, older than I remembered, but clear. "I didn't steal anything," he continued. "But I did make a mistake. Ryan approached me last year with an investment opportunity for a client, a development fund offshore. At first it seemed legitimate. Then I realized he was using my firm's accounts to launder money. I confronted him, but by then the damage was already done. If I reported him, the fallout could destroy the firm and my license along with it. If I stayed quiet, it would look like I was complicit." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "That's when Vanessa got involved. I thought she didn't know, but she did. She was working with Ryan to secure herself financially in case everything collapsed. When I found out, I moved what funds I could into Lucas's trust and changed my will. It was the only way to keep the money safe from them, from the firm, from anyone who'd try to take it." He looked straight into the camera, now voice softer. "I know you'll want to hate her, Mom. Maybe you already do. But don't. She's made terrible choices, yes, but I wasn't innocent either. I let ambition blind me. I thought I could fix everything quietly, but I underestimated how far they'd go." He drew a shaky breath. I've left Thomas all the documents he needs to prove what really happened. If anything happens to me, give them to the authorities. Protect Lucas, but don't let bitterness eat you alive. The truth is messy, but it's still the truth. The screen flickered, and for a moment I thought it had ended. Then Daniel leaned closer, his expression tender. You did everything right, Mom. You raised me to be better than I was. If I can't make this right myself, I trust you will. For Lucas. For all of us. The video ended. For a long time I sat frozen, the faint hum of the computer filling the silence. My son's confession settled over me like dust, terrible, undeniable, and strangely freeing. He hadn't been perfect. None of us were. But everything he'd done, even the mistakes, had been driven by love and fear for the boy sleeping upstairs. I stared at the screen until tears blurred the text of the last open file. Evidence: Ryan and Vanessa transactions. Inside were bank statements, encrypted messages, wire transfers, proof of exactly what Daniel had described. Enough to expose both of them. The doorbell startled me. My heart lurched. For a second I thought it might be Vanessa again. But when I looked through the peephole I saw Thomas. He stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. You called, I nodded, motioning to the computer. I found something, a video from Daniel. He bent over the desk, scanning the files. As the realization sank in, his expression hardened. This changes everything. This isn't just about custody anymore. It's criminal. He wanted it to end, I said quietly. He wanted the truth out. Thomas sat back, exhaling. Then that's what we'll do. We'll turn this over to the district attorney first thing tomorrow. But I wasn't looking at the computer anymore. I was staring at the window where headlights had just swept across the driveway. My stomach tightened. Thomas the First, whispered someone's here. He moved toward the front door, cautiously glancing outside. It's her. Vanessa's car idled in the rain engine, running, her figure barely visible through the windshield. Then she stepped out, clutching something under her coat. Stay back, Thomas warned, but I was already moving. I opened the door before she could knock. Rain streaked her face, washing away what was left of her makeup. You found it, didn't you? She said hoarsely. The video. I didn't answer. Her eyes darted toward Thomas, then back to me. He recorded everything. You think that clears him? He ruined me, Eleanor. He destroyed both of us. Daniel tried to protect his son, I said. Even after everything, he wanted you to have a chance to be better. She laughed bitterly. Better? There's no better after this. Ryan's already gone. He cleaned out the accounts and disappeared. And when they start digging, they'll think I helped him. I'll lose everything. You still have Lucas, I said softly. You could still choose to be his mother again if you stopped running. For a moment something broke through her anger, a flicker of something almost human. Then it vanished. No, she whispered. You've already taken him. You and your precious son. Thomas stepped between us. Vanessa, you need to leave. The police have been notified. They'll be here soon. She turned to me again, her voice trembling. Do you think you've won? You haven't. You just get to live long enough to watch everything crumble. Then she dropped the envelope she'd been holding onto the porch and fled back to her car. Tires screeched as she sped off into the rain. When the sound faded, I bent down and picked up the envelope. Inside were photos, grainy surveillance shots of Ryan at an airport, a boarding pass stamped Grand Cayman. He'd run just like Daniel had predicted. Thomas exhaled. She's unraveling. But these tie it all together. Once the authorities get this, there'll be no doubt about who's responsible. The next week passed in a blur of statements, interviews, and late-night calls. The investigation moved quickly once the files were handed over. Ryan's offshore accounts were frozen. Vanessa was summoned for questioning. Every secret Daniel had buried rose to the surface. Through it all, Lucas stayed close to me, his small world blessedly untouched by the chaos unfolding outside. We baked cookies, planted tulips, read stories before bed. Sometimes he'd ask about his father, and I'd tell him the truth, not the perfect version, but the real one. That Daniel loved fiercely, that he tried his best, that he made mistakes but never stopped trying to protect the people he loved. By the time spring came, the air felt lighter. The house that had once been haunted by grief now echoed with the sound of life again. Eli's laughter in the hallway, birds in the garden, the soft ticking of Daniel's watch on the mantel. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, Thomas stopped by with the final court documents. "It's done," he said. "The investigation cleared Daniel. Ryan's being extradited. And Vanessa, she's agreed to voluntary relinquishment of parental rights." I stared at him. "She signed it." He nodded. "She left this for you." He handed me a folded note. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. "Eleanor, I can't fix what I've broken. Maybe one day Lucas will understand. Tell him I loved him in my own terrible way." I folded the note and slipped it into the memory box beside Daniel's letter. "I'll tell him the truth," I said quietly. That night, after Lucas went to bed, I sat on the porch watching the stars shimmer across the water. Daniel's words echoed in my mind, "Don't let bitterness eat you alive." For the first time in years, I felt peace instead of rage, love instead of loss. The fight was over. Justice had come quietly, not through revenge, but through truth. The wind stirred the trees soft and steady, and I whispered to the night, "We did it, Daniel. He's safe. You can rest now." Inside, the clock chimed softly. Lucas stirred upstairs, murmuring in his sleep. I smiled, standing to turn out the lights, the home warm and alive around me once more. Before heading to bed, I wrote the last line in my journal, the one Daniel started with, "Trust your instincts, protect him." Then I added my own beneath it, "And forgive. Always forgive." If you've ever lost someone and fought to protect what they loved, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because sometimes love and truth are the greatest acts of revenge.